very, very much. This is a very, very special occasion indeed to have such a distinguished participants, supporters, and certainly the intellectual founder of ERIA here in the room, Mr. Nikai, and his colleagues from the Japanese dialect. Here on stage this morning, we have two distinguished panelists. One who comes all the way from Paris, from the background of being in the administration in Washington, D.C., also with deep experiences and engagements with the OECD, both in Washington, his capital, and in Paris. And his responsibility now is to promote OECD's engagements with the global community. And as Mr. Danvers has just said to us, they have just signed an agreement, and this occasion is the celebration of that first anniversary of that memorandum of understanding between the OECD and ERIA. So Mr. Danvers is going to give us his perspectives on the works that the OECD and ERIA, which is supposed to be the OECD of East Asia, as Mr. Nikai has just told us. What would be the perspectives of the OECD working with ERIA in the promotion of better policies for all the countries in the region of East Asia? The second panelist is not a stranger to our fora here in East Asia, Minister Marie Pangestu, who was Minister of Trade and Minister of Tourism and Creative Economy here in Jakarta. I had the privilege of working with her for many years. But now she is a professor at the University of Indonesia, also a researcher at Jakarta, distinguished visitor at the RAND Corporation. She has a lot of experiences promoting the economic integration of ASEAN, of East Asia. She will have a lot to share with us after Mr. Danvers makes his presentation of his views of how the OECD sees the landscape of East Asia, of ASEAN, moving forward into the future, particularly after this year, when we move into the community at the end of this year, to be launched in Kuala Lumpur. So, just to begin this panel, I would like to ask Mr. William Danvers to give us his brief presentation of the overview of how the OECD and ERIA can collaborate together moving forward into the future. Mr. You can do it from there, you can do it from here, however you want, however you're comfortable. Please.
Why don't I try to use a little more formal, although our remarks are formal. We'll do a combo, a formal and informal. So the OECD has had 2 decades of activity in the region and expertise in most areas of economic policy making. And that means that we bring to the table the collective and accumulated experience of 34 member countries, but we also bring to the table many of the collective experience of our partner countries that participate with the OECD in various capacities. Now, it's in that context that the OECD hopes to contribute to ASEAN nations in support of the further growth and integration of the region. The OECD has a broad mandate, including work in a number of key policy areas, which I mentioned in my opening remarks. And we hope and believe that this could be of interest to the nations of Southeast Asia. Now, there are lots of opportunities for engagement between the OECD and ASEAN nations, and that includes peer reviews, economics and social surveys, participation in OECD bodies such as committees and working groups, adherence to existing OECD instruments, and participation in the development of new ones, and integration in OECD databases and data collection. Now, for example, the OECD is one of the world's largest and most reliable sources of international statistic, economic, and social data, and they provide international benchmarks and tools for analysis to policymakers, researchers, and business. Now, in order to strengthen and consolidate over 2 decades of engagement with the Southeast Asian region, at the Ministerial Council meeting in May 2014, as mentioned, Secretary General Angel Garea and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe launched the Southeast Asia Regional Program. And the purpose of the program, the focus of the program, is to support regional integration and openness. And the support will consist of good policy practice exchanges among policymakers in both OECD and ASEAN countries in order to develop common solutions to regional and global challenges. The Southeast Asia Regional Program is made up of 6 regional policy networks as well as 3 initiatives. And the idea here is to engage the region and to reform and align policies in areas such as tax, investment, education and skills, small and medium-sized enterprises, reg reform, trade, gender, innovation, PPPs, public-private partnerships. And the first meetings of the regional policy networks and initiatives have been held during the last year, designating ASEAN and OECD co-chairs in outlining work programs. We figure that kind of continuity collaboration is really the only way to proceed. Now, complementing these regional efforts, the program is intensifying work with Indonesia, a key partner of the OECD, as well as the Philippines, which is the 2015 APEC chair, and of course Malaysia, which is the 2015 ASEAN chair. The OECD has held several events in Jakarta, including most recently, just this past March, and we attracted over 500 participants from all 10 ASEAN countries. The March meeting, now it included the first steering group meeting of the program in the OECD Southeast Asia Regional Forum on regional integration and openness. And we signed, as mentioned by several of us this morning, at the MCM, our ministerial meeting in 2014, the OECD ERIA MOU, and that formalizes and frames support for ASEAN and its members, including on issues such as SMEs, PPPs, global value chains, and as Mr. Nikkei quite rightly mentioned, disaster risk management, an absolutely important issue that we all need to look at. Now, in particular, OECD and ERIA developed the ASEAN SME Policy Index for 2014 report with ASEAN SME working groups. Now, it measures the scope and quality of SME support policies and institutions in all ASEAN countries. Now, we believe it's an important step toward upgrading and aligning policies and institutions throughout the region. ERIA also contributed to the steering group meeting in the OECD Southeast Asia Regional Forum, the regional policy network meetings on SMEs, PPPs, and investment, and the Forum on Disaster Management in Sendai, Japan, just this past March, a very important forum. Further collaboration may include a disaster risk management symposium, joint research on disasters and supply chain risks, and further work on successful ASEAN SME Policy Index. Now, with respect to regional integration in Southeast Asia, remarkable progress has been made in recent decades, but there's an opportunity to realize further gains. Now, for example, although tariff barriers have by and large disappeared, only around 20% of trade and investment flows in the region are among ASEAN countries, the remainder being with the rest of the world. In addition, substantial divergence in the level of development between Southeast Asian countries remains a major obstacle. Regarding economic openness, Southeast Asian countries are, by and large, very open to the rest of the world. But unfortunately, it's not the case with all ASEAN nations. While trade amounts to 300% of GDP in Singapore, 150% of GDP in Thailand and Malaysia, it's only around 50% of GDP in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Myanmar. increasing trade flows in those countries would make good economic sense. And the 6 regional policy networks that I mentioned, and the 3 initiatives of Southeast Asia, of the Southeast Asia program, serve to frame further regional cooperation. And the Regional Policy Network on Investment, for example, analyzes, reviews, and recommends changes to investment policy frameworks. And we've already completed, or are in the process of completing, carrying out OECD investment policy reviews in 8 of the 10 ASEAN member countries. The Trade Initiative also plays an important role in shaping integration policies, analyzing global value chains and emerging policy issues. The ASEAN Working Group for SME Policies and the ASEAN SME Policy Index, as well as the RPN on SME Policies, helps improve, complement, and streamline SME support and promotion policies. This helps countries boost productivity in assisting enterprises to complete regionally and globally and to diversify and move to higher value-added activities, moving up that value chain. The regional policy networks on connectivity meet the tremendous infrastructure needs, and I would suggest opportunities the region faces by bringing relevant policy and expertise to help attract sustainable investment in these sectors. Now, a key step was the ASEAN PPP principles, which OECD helped develop and which ASEAN ministers welcomed in November 2014. Now, this gives you just a general sense of the work the OECD is doing regionally in the context of the Southeast Asian regional program. But it also underscores the important and useful collaboration between the OECD and our colleagues in ERIA. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Danvers. Thank you for covering many of those issues relevant to the work between the OECD and ERIA, particularly pertaining to the landscape of East Asia, Southeast Asia. Madame Pangestu is not going to make a formal presentation, but I hope she will react to some of the issues that Mr. Danvers has brought up, particularly in the areas of integration, in the areas of SMEs, investment, trade among us or between us and between ASEAN and the rest of the world. Madame Pangestu has served as chair of the ASEAN Economic Ministers once when Indonesia was in the chair. So she has seen from the perspective of member states of ASEAN and from the perspective of chairing that ASEAN ministers who are charged with economic integration here in this region. And on top of that, trying to integrate, trying to be connected with the wider Asia through, I guess what we are working on now is the ASEAN Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. ASEAN also had been under her responsibility for a year, and her move into other areas of responsibility now should give her some perspectives on how ASEAN has progressed in the area of economic cooperation, economic integration. Madam, please.
Thank you, Surin. Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to be here to talk about this very important topic about how we can inspire the ASEAN community towards 2025. Before I make my remarks, I'd like to recognize Mr. Mikai-san, who was also my colleague in the trade ministers process, and I'd like to think that we also worked hard to make ERIA happen and to be based in Jakarta. And I would like to appreciate ERIA that all the support and work that ERIA has provided both to the Indonesian government as well as to all the work we have been doing on ASEAN and East Asia integration. And I do appreciate the newer role of OECD on the various issues that was just explained by Mr. Danvers. I think this is really going to be a very important discussion in the years to come. I'd like to just maybe say three things. First of all, I'd like to perhaps, we talk a lot about what we need to do within ASEAN and East Asian integration, but I think we also have to know what's going on in the rest of the world, to know whether what we are talking about is still relevant, or should we be thinking about other things or about other priorities. I say this because I just came from the spring meetings in DC, and there a lot of the discussion was relatively gloomy on growth, lower growth projection, lower trade to GDP that has been occurring for the last 5-10 years, and a much lower growth on trade than ever before. I think trade is only expected to grow 2-3% compared to 5% before the crisis. And it's not just about the cyclical crisis, post-crisis situation, but there's this big debate going on whether this is really actually a secular stagnation or not. Yeah? And emerging markets, including ASEAN and East Asia, are included in there. Obviously, the big story out there is the slowdown in China, a very sharp slowdown in China. But I think the bottom line is that for future growth, if we want trade to continue to be a future engine of growth, it cannot be like business as usual like before, the way we always see, okay, goods, production network. It's what OECD has done a lot of work on, which is the global value chain. The way trade is happening is different compared to 5-10 years ago because of technology, because of services. The embedded services that happen inside global value chain is really kind of the future way of doing trade, and that's where the increased productivity, increased innovation, increased value added, increased jobs is going to happen. And this is where the priority for economic integration should be. I mean, the good side, actually, I think we are, as already mentioned, the tariffs are already low, goods are already flowing, but it's the services, it's the facilitation of goods, it's investment, and so on. So the new issues of trade and the way we move forward, both in ASEAN and East Asia, needs to happen in those areas. Because otherwise, the productivity and innovation-driven growth that has helped ASEAN grow, East Asia grow, but it's no longer going to be the same story for the next 10 years. This is what the predictions are saying, that we are on a lower growth and trade trajectory, and partly it's because of demography, and it's partly because of lower productivity growth. So if you want to increase productivity growth as well as deal with lower growth from employment creation because of demography, both in China and the US, but in Southeast Asia we have the opposite problem. We have a demographic bonus. We have the young productive labor force, but they may not be just going into factories. They may also be going, we hope, into higher value added services and be part of the global value chain. Now, what is the role for ASEAN and East Asian economic integration to make this happen and to have new sources of productivity and innovation-driven growth? This is kind of, I think, the big question out there. Now, let's talk about the second issue I'd like to raise is then obviously what should we be doing more, or what is the projection for 2015 and post-2015. I will just talk about the economic integration, but obviously there are other aspects to it. While we can agree on the overall notion that we want openness and regional integration because it's good for us, unfortunately the political, this was also another bit of the discussion that kept on coming back in various discussions on trade. Unfortunately, at the same time, we're being just juxtaposed with increased protectionism, yeah? Not just in some of the ASEAN countries, but also everywhere. You talk about the US, you talk about Europe. It's the same issue, and it's kind of the situation where what do you do? with this situation where you know the need for growth has to come from more opening up, and you know, as an economist, and all the models will tell you, and all the numbers that, all the analysis that ERIA and OECD that do so well will show you that it will benefit the country. But politically speaking, when you try to say that in a domestic situation, it just doesn't work out that way. So we have this challenge, and I don't know what the answer is, but I do think regional commitments, regional integration, the way we have seen it from 30 years ago, 40 years ago when we first started ASEAN, can play a role, okay? Maybe the role has to change. Surin and I have been, I think, in both as academics and in government, recognize this. I mean, ASEAN was created as a training ground. So if you say ASEAN integration is only 20% of trade, it's because ASEAN is not very big as a market. But it went from 20 to 25%. Yeah. And the interesting thing is that extra-ASEAN trade growth is actually faster than intra-ASEAN, which shows that we are open regionalism in the true sense of the word. We are extra-ASEAN is growing faster than intra-ASEAN. We are not diverting trade. We're actually, as with the ASEAN spirit, ASEAN is a training ground. We work together, we create a community to become more competitive, to be able to compete in the external market, but without diverting trade. So that's the spirit. And I just finished a paper on 50 years of Indonesian trade history. And there were certain points in the Indonesian trade history where, because of the ASEAN commitment, we adopted a tariff reduction schedule, which was then multilateralized. We adopted national single window because we had ASEAN single window, and so on and so forth. So the role of regional commitments on the process of domestic reforms is, I think, something we have to keep on reminding ourselves. We may have to use a different language, but it does happen that the regional commitments have an impact on the domestic situation. But right now we are facing the harder parts of the reform. It's services, it's the movement of professionals, and investment. These are the more difficult, behind the border issues, standards. These are the much more difficult issues to deal with. We may have to use a different language just because of political, what do you say? We are both experienced in this. How do you say it without actually saying, basically what you have to say is that this is regional integration and opening up. Even if you use the word opening up, sometimes politicians or political people will find it very difficult to say. So you have to turn it around, I think. It's very important for us to increase national competitiveness, productivity, innovation, invest in human capital. And to do that, you need to do A, B, C, D, E, right? So you don't even mention the word opening up. But focus it on the need to increase productivity and competitiveness. And you can only do that if you're also part of the global value chain and so on and so forth. I'm still thinking through how to best resell the same messages that we think. At the end of the day, I always go from pessimistic to optimistic when I talk about ASEAN, but at the end of the day, I'm more on the optimistic side because we have seen how it goes up and down, but the impact on domestic policies, it shapes and puts a frame to domestic policies. Much like, then my last point would be, the third point would be, how does ASEAN integration and ASEAN economic community and what we are trying to do in widening ASEAN community with the East Asia RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, how does that fit into the larger regional or multilateral trade landscape? I'd like to believe that RCEP is open regionalism again, because I said this in my panel at the IMF, because there the discussion was, do we go TPP or do we go RCEP or do we go TTIP, which is the Europe US transatlantic partnership? There's a lot of discussion on that. I said, well, we don't actually know what's going on in TPP because We are not part of the negotiations, we don't know what's going on. But in RCEP, we know what's going on. It's open regionalism. We have open accession. If the US wants to join, they can. We are not clear how a country like China or Indonesia would join TPP. But for RCEP, US wants to join, they can join. And India is already in there. And it's stage by stage evolutionary. And capacity building is very important. And I think this is a role for ERIA and OECD. Because the final problem with all this is that inequities have increased within countries. And a lot of the reason why inequities have been increasing and therefore the benefits of integration have not been widely spread is capacity building, infrastructure. I believe very much that infrastructure is a very important component to integrate us and reduce the inequities and make SMEs, make less developed areas be beneficiaries of integration. So the work on PPP, access to infrastructure, funding, expertise, and so on, this is going to be, I believe, probably the most important area for future work.
Thank you.